Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. U.S. President Donald Trump says he'll speak with China's Xi Jinping on Friday as negotiators reach a framework deal to keep TikTok running in the U.S. All eyes on the Fed. An appeals court has blocked Trump from firing Lisa Cook, while his ally, Stephen Miran, has now been confirmed as a Fed governor by the Senate. And Marco Rubio has refrained from criticizing Israel over its missile strike on Qatar. The U.S. Secretary of State is now heading to Doha in a show of support. Well, it's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Bersace in Dubai. Lots of news coming through from the U.S. In the late afternoon yesterday. We're going to get through that in a short while. But first, a quick glance at markets. Once again, a record high for the S&P. This is where we're leaning today, up about 8 basis points. But then also some new highs reached in these Asia-Pacific markets as well. We'll talk about that shortly with David Inglis. But point is today, we are leaning towards the green. 2-year yields hovering at the lows not seen since last September as we get into that Fed meeting tomorrow. And obviously with a confirmation now that Miran is going to be voting and indeed Lisa Cook. So we have better understanding of who exactly will be on the FOMC voting committee at tomorrow's meeting. USD also slipping. Worth pointing out now, the dollar is 10.5% weaker for the year. And then the gold, another record high, up 7 basis points this morning. All-time record high once again for gold. Let's flip over. One thing I do just want to point out, and I keep saying this every day, is record highs, record highs, record highs in stocks. But actually the correlation between what's happening in bonds versus stocks is very, very low at this point in time. So people have been pointing out that fixed income perhaps is telling you a more bearish story about the trajectory for the U.S. economy, whereas the stock market is painting a much more rosy picture, perhaps because there is so much of an AI emphasis in the stocks that have been carrying these markets to a new high after new high. So something to think about there. So treasuries versus equities telling you a different story. Okay, let's check in on how markets in Asia are faring. David Inglis is in Hong Kong. David.
Well, Jamana, good morning and good afternoon from the Asia Pacific. I'll borrow your phrase, record high after record high after record high after record high after record high. I could get to 9 days in a row. We are now 9 days on the Asia Pacific. That's certainly what we're seeing here in the Asia Pacific. Again, it's the same story. You look at AI, to your point, right? AI seems to be offsetting most of the risks out there. You look at the Kospi index, I'll show you chips in a moment. Our measures of vol, for example, Nikkei is just one of them, as you can see, down ahead of the Fed conversation. And yields are, to your other point there, flip the page, please, also simply indicating that things might be cooling down, but not to the extent that it's a problem for equity markets. Chips on the up, the Nvidia bounce into the close, really lifting the overall tide. Disco, by the way, listed in Japan, is Morgan Stanley's top pick. They've laid that note out today as far as semiconductor equipment makers are concerned. You mentioned gold. I'll leave you with this. Gold, and of course, we have a big listing here in Hong Kong, which is the global leader in LiDAR equipment. Massive first day at school, 12%, and then a point in gold. Gold and gold plays are also reflecting this move up in spot gold, which, by the way, hit a record, to your point, here in the Asia session a few hours back. Jomana.
Yeah, record high after record high for many days in a row. David Inglis in Hong Kong, thank you. Now, President Trump says he'll have a phone call with China's Xi Jinping this week after American and Chinese officials meeting in Madrid reached a framework deal on keeping the TikTok app running in the U.S.
I'm speaking to President Xi on Friday for confirmation of that and, you know, frankly, more importantly, a big deal. And we've had very good meetings. As you know, we were in Europe, our people, Scott Bessent and Jameson Greer and others. And it was a very big meeting with China. And, you know, they're treating us with respect. We treat them with respect, too. But it was very successful.
Let's get out to our China economy and government editor in Hong Kong, Alan Wong. Alan, yesterday when Stephen Engel was running us through the talks of the weekend, I described them as TikTok talks as opposed to trade deal talks. And it seems that is exactly what actually conspired by the end of the evening, because we now have clarity that there will be some form of a framework for a TikTok deal. What do we know about its content?
Yeah, that was exactly right. It was a talk about TikTok. But TikTok was also connected to all the other issues between the U.S. and China, including a potential phone call this Friday between President Xi and President Trump. And after that, a potential meeting in person between the two leaders in next month. So the TikTok talks aren't just about one company, but even if it's just about TikTok, there's a lot to talk about. Yes, they reached some sort of a framework deal, some consensus about what that deal is going to look like, but there are critical uncertainties about what that deal might entail. One is whether China will keep some stakes in the new company. They'll keep the U.S. operations of the social media platform going. And second is which U.S. companies or whether there's any U.S. government involvement in the operation of this new entity. And then third, whether China or the U.S. will control the core technology that makes TikTok so powerful and influential to begin with. So these are the things that the talk actually didn't address, or at least the officials involved didn't tell us about.
And Trump is saying that he's going to be having a call with Xi Jinping on Friday. What are the expectations for that call?
As Trump himself said, he is looking for a big deal at the end of all these exchanges, not necessarily from the phone call this Friday, but Trump is never just thinking about one thing. There's a lot of issues they can talk about. We know that the U.S. Treasury Secretary Besson said after the first day of meeting that they actually talked about trade imbalances and that the Chinese side came with very aggressive ask, in his own words. So what those requests might be, we don't know precisely, but there's a lot that Xi and Trump can talk about. One thing that we know that the two sides haven't been able to come to an agreement on is about trade, because Besson himself also said that the two sides weren't able to reach an agreement on the massive trade imbalances between the two economies.
Well, I guess there's still some time with the deadline there extended until November. So we still got a couple of months, I guess, to get that across the line. Alan Wong, thank you so much for the reporting. Let's switch over. A U.S. appeals court has blocked President Trump from removing Fed Governor Lisa Cook from her post while her lawsuit challenges the dismissal procedure. That decision came as the Senate voted to confirm the president's economic advisor, Stephen Miran, to join the central bank board. And that means both governors could be involved in the crucial FOMC meeting beginning later today. Balazs Pence, Bloomberg's news desk editor, joins us now. Well, all of these Fed movements around the personnel happening very close to a very important meeting that's taking place the next couple of days. Let's just start with Lisa Cook and the fact that an appeals court has actually ruled in her favor, at least temporarily. Does that set the stage for her to, number one, be a voting member at this Fed meeting? And then later on, what does this mean down the track? Is this story over and done with, or could they appeal once again?
Yeah, Joanna, it's far from over and done with. You're right, the fog is lifting a little bit, at least, when it comes to the composition of the board when that very crucial Fed meeting starts tomorrow. The appeals court just ruled that Lisa Cook can remain on the Fed while her case plays out. And they upheld the earlier temporary injunction by a lower court, which allows that. The president still has an opportunity to appeal to the Supreme Court if he chooses so. There's very little time left, obviously. So we don't exactly know if she will indeed be there. And her case will continue in courts. It will work its way through, probably through various appeals. So it will be some time before we get clarity on that. But right now it looks like both her and Stephen Miran will be part of that very, very crucial rate decision that investors have been watching for months and have circled on their calendars as potentially the start of a new easing cycle by the Fed.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Stephen Miran as well, and the fact that actually this was a pretty fast-tracked confirmation process, and it was tight in the end, 48 to 47. But he is going to be a temporary voting member in nature. Could that dictate the path of the Fed and further dovishness in the months to come, or will it not move the needle that much?
It seems unlikely that his involvement will move the needle for this particular meeting coming up. The consensus in the market is that there will be a 25 basis point cut, although we do know that the president is pushing for more. He predicted a big cut by the Fed at this meeting. And we do know that the newest Fed member is someone who agrees with that position. So it's unlikely that he will move the needle for this particular meeting. All the other members have their own personal models and their own personal preferences to work through. But once you have someone in there, they can start sort of working the phones and talking to the other members and getting their point of view across and building that majority toward a more dovish Fed. That is certainly possible. We are not sure how long Stephen Miran will be on the Fed. We're not sure what exactly he will push for at this particular meeting, but he will be yet another dovish voice in that group of decision makers.
Yeah. Balazs Pence, Bloomberg's news desk editor, walking us through all of the developments at the Fed ahead of that crucial meeting tomorrow, well, today and tomorrow. Still ahead, Asian stocks hit a high alongside gold, taking a cue from Wall Street. We are counting down to that Fed decision with ANZ next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. U.S. stocks have set a new record while yields test the bottom of the range through September as markets price in a 25 basis point cut from the Fed on Wednesday. Joining us now is Mahjabeen Zaman, ANZ Bank's head of FX research. Morning to you. I'm sure you heard in the prior segment, I was speaking to my colleague about the personnel changes in the last 24 hours and the fact that Lisa Cook will actually be voting at this meeting alongside Stephen Miran as well. Is that likely to influence the outcome tomorrow?
Look, I think Lisa Cook has been leaning dovish anyway, and that 25 basis points easing is pretty much priced in. I think for us, the key takeaway will be what the future guidance is going to sound like. Is that going to be hawkish? Is that going to be dovish? And what the balance of, preferences are. How many holds do we get? How many 25 basis points cuts and how many 50? So, of course, as you said, Stephen Miran, maybe at the margin, Waller, Bowman are the ones who are a little bit more dovish. So you could see those 50 basis points cuts. And then there's some others which have been, which have expressed concerns around that inflation picking up again. And so not to be aggressive with the easing.
Yeah. There are some people out there who are saying that the Fed should opt for a 50 basis point jumbo cut. But if they do that, are they not then sending a message to the market that they're overweighting one side of their dual mandate? Because, yes, we speak about the weakness in the labor market, but at the same time, inflation has been above target for the past 4 years. You look at consumer expectations for inflation, the latest University of Michigan one-year inflation forecast, and that's in a 4 handle. Would they not be overlooking one side of the mandate if they lean too dovish or even opt for a larger rate cut at this meeting?
Look, I guess, if that is the surprise that we get, look, it's not hard to go back 12 months. Last September, we got the jumbo cut, and that at that point of time, the job market was nowhere near as how it is today. And then the concerns back then were also that around the employment mandate, which kind of triggered that 50 basis points easing. So again, there is a risk that they go a little bit stronger at this stage, but I think you need to see a little bit more inflation prints before going so aggressive. The growth story in the U.S. is still holding up pretty well. With the trend growth, we are still growing well above trend growth of 1.8%. So I think that's something that will keep the majority a little bit on the edge and stick to that 25.
Yeah, and the dollar has been steadily slipping lower in the last couple of sessions. We're actually now down more than 10% for the year. At what point does this get turned around? At what point does support actually come in to the greenback?
Look, it's going to be difficult to see that come in anytime soon. Sure, if you get a hawkish cut, you might see a little bit of a bounce up. But look, I think our view remains that we are in an environment where dollar is going to gradually continue to move lower. And this is out of years of overvaluation, and for it to move another 5% from here, for example, into next year, that's just a normalization of overvalued levels. And also, I think the number one driver of dollar weakness for at least for the first half of this year has been policy uncertainty. And I think that's going to continue, at least for this next couple of years.
Yeah. Okay. Let's pivot a little bit because there are other central bank meetings this week. The Bank of England not expected to cut interest rates, so we may see some changes to the balance sheets and quantitative tightening. But let me just ask you, when it comes to interest rate policy, the Bank of England are been getting into quite a tricky place because we talk about the weakish growth backdrop, but at the same time, inflationary pressures on the wage side still very prominent.
I agree. I think wage pressures are the number one sort of challenge for BOE. I mean, growing at about 4.6% in June and consistently outpacing inflation itself. And that's the challenge for the BOE, which we saw at the last meeting. They were very much mixed in terms of what action to, in terms of the vote, in terms of which way to go. Our view remains that the job market and the unemployment rate will be front of mind, similar to probably the Federal Reserve. We actually expect a hold at this meeting, but we do see 2 more rate cuts ahead, one in Q4 and one in Q1 next year.
Do you have a view on where the pound could get to versus the USD? We just had it pulled up 136. I mean, so many of these trades have worked out for euro and pound, and less so because of the strength of those currencies, but more so because of the weakness in the USD. Do you have a target on where we could get to?
Yeah, well, look, I think we are expecting 138 going forward for the sterling, and that's really, as you said, at the back on the back of a weaker dollar, because in the UK we still have the autumn budget that's coming up. There are expectations that there could be an increase in taxes on households and businesses as the government seeks to narrow the fiscal gap, and that's going to obviously put pressure on longer-term yields for the wrong reasons. And so there's only a limit into how much upside you could potentially see in the sterling vis-a-vis the euro, Aussie, and the other G10 currencies.
Okay, and then to round things up, we have Bank of Japan as well. Do you think they will actually deliver a rate hike by the end of this year?
Yes, we actually still considering an October rate hike. We did see real cash earnings finally turn into positive territory in July. CPI has been averaging around 3% for some time now. So I think that's going to be helpful for the yen and for the BOJ to shift. But of course, near term, we've got the October 4 elections. Let's see who comes in, what their view is. Again, there are, different candidates. And even if there is a candidate who comes in who wants a slower normalization of the BOJ, it's not the end of the normalization. It might be a little bit of a lag. But I think that process has begun and it will continue into next year.
Mahjabeen, Zaman, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. ANZ, Head of FX Research. And coming up, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is set to visit Qatar after refraining from criticizing Israel over its missile strike on Doha. We have the latest next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has refrained from criticizing Israel over its missile strike on Qatar, saying the priority is to make sure Hamas surrenders and disarms to end the war in Gaza. Rubio has now just departed to Doha to determine what role Qatar can still play in resolving the Gaza conflict. The tiny Gulf state also hosted a summit of Arab and Islamic nations in the hopes of presenting a united response to Israel's attack. Joining us now is Bloomberg's managing editor for economy and government in the Middle East and Africa. Paul, yesterday we were speaking about the fact that this was a strong show of support by the U.S. Towards Israel, and indeed the Israeli Prime Minister on Sunday used that as an opportunity to emphasize the strength of the relationship between U.S. and Israel. What came out of Secretary of State Marco Rubio's visit to Israel?
In many ways, it was just that. It was a show of strength when it comes to U.S.-Israeli ties and a show of just how strong those bonds are, for all that they were somewhat strained by Israel's attack on Doha last week. Marco Rubio has literally just left Israel on his way to Qatar before he goes to the UK to coincide with Trump's visit there. In Qatar, I think it seems like he's going to try to get Qatar back to its mediation role, if you like, and to step up efforts to either achieve a ceasefire or to end the war. The other thing that seems to have happened is that he's effectively told Israel that it's okay with the offensive on Gaza City, which is likely to step up as soon as today.
And how likely is it that Qatar actually resumes its mediation efforts? And this, we speak on the heels of an important summit that was held in Qatar yesterday. You saw some of the biggest leaders from around the region, including the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and others, fly into Doha in a show of support also for Qatar. Did anything come out of that summit to suggest that Qatar may be rethinking its mediation role?
Not in so much. Qatar said from the beginning that it signaled that from the start of Tuesday, for all its outrage, for all its comments that this was state terrorism on the part of Israel as far as it was concerned, it signaled that it would be willing to carry on with this mediation role. It said, however, that it didn't. The only outcome of those strikes on Doha against the Hamas, targeting the Hamas officials, as far as Qatar was concerned, was that the talks would be hindered and stalled, and that Hamas would simply not go back into them. So I think Rubio will try and encourage Qatar to put more pressure on Hamas to come back to the negotiation table. But at the same time, Israel is insisting that Israel doesn't really want a ceasefire anymore. That's sort of something that was in its strategy maybe 2 months ago, but now it's insisting on a full surrender of Hamas and a full disarmament and a release of all the 48 hostages that are still in Gaza, around 20 of which are thought to be alive. So there are a lot of things that still need to be squared, but what I think is clear is that Israel is going to step up its offensive in the north of Gaza. It says that will increase the chances of Hamas surrendering. Most of the rest of the world says this will be a disaster for Palestinian civilians there.
Paul, thank you very much. Paul Wallace, Bloomberg's managing editor for economy and government in the Middle East and Africa. Thank you. Well, some breaking news also coming through in the tech space. This just dropping from CNBC. OpenAI has hired former ex-AI CFO Mike Liberatore. And his job will start on Tuesday, so he's beginning there. And, of course, this marks just another chapter in that rivalry between Elon Musk and Sam Altman, with OpenAI continuing to poach some former ex-AI, i.e. the AI company founded by Elon Musk, to OpenAI. So this is just the latest blow for XAI. The CFO is now moving to OpenAI. Well, coming up, we talk to Prem Kumar, partner at DGA-Albright's Stonebridge Group and former U.S. National Security Council Senior Director, as Arab and Muslim countries condemn Israel's attack on the Qatari capital. Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. U.S. President Donald Trump says he'll speak with China's Xi Jinping on Friday as negotiators reach a framework deal to keep TikTok running in the U.S. All eyes on the Fed. An appeals court has blocked Trump from firing Lisa Cook, while his ally, Stephen Miran, has now been confirmed as a Fed governor by the Senate. And a long-delayed $3 billion project to end a growing water crisis in South Africa's commercial hub has hit fresh opposition. We are live in Johannesburg with the latest. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Versace in Dubai. Let's get you up to speed on these markets before that important Fed meeting tomorrow. 25 basis point rate cut baked in. But will they sound dovish? That is the big question for markets. S&P building on from a record high again yesterday, today, also trading in the green. So up 7 basis points for these futures. 2-year yields also sitting just about 3.53. We've got about 3 rate cuts priced in by the end of this year. Not doing a whole lot today, but still, if you rewind back, the last time we were at these levels was last September. So it's been a while since the 2-year yield was trading this low. USD also slipping down about 10 basis points, 10% or 10.5% weaker for the year so far. And then gold, another record high. Look, we're getting close to 3,700 now. It was not that long ago. I believe it was 10 days ago. We were speaking to Citi, global head of commodities, and they said that their target for the year was 3,600. We've blown through that to the upside now. Switching over, just a quick look at this correlation chart. Interesting because it tracks the correlation between the price action that's been going on in stocks and bonds. And what you can see, there's very little correlation here, which tells you that both of them are sort of doing their own things and not taking their cue from each other. So bonds are telling you their own story about the state of the U.S. economy and that a slowdown is expected. Meanwhile, stocks keep going from strength to strength, record to record, and perhaps pricing in a lot of the positive momentum around AI and some of the hype around key mega cap stocks in the U.S. So two different stories there. Okay, let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring. David Inglis is in Hong Kong. David.
Hey, yep. I was looking at the chart. Reminds me of, it's the same thing, right? The same economic reality. It's almost like a husband and wife having a conversation about the same thing, yet, they're just not talking about the same thing. It's just like, it's not permeating the other side of the conversation. I think the point is being, it's not that extreme enough for it to actually matter. We talked about these record rallies, right? 2% higher on the tech gauge for the Asia-Pacific benchmark. Chips, and of course within the decade you have Disco, of course, which I mentioned earlier is Morgan Stanley's topic within semiconductors. Asia Pacific, again, new highs there. 9 days now. Flip the page, please, which is the longest win streak going back to 2020. So this is a five-year superlative as far as the streak is concerned. You mentioned the dollar. This is the iteration of that in the Asia Pacific. 7-week low on the Bloomberg Dollar Index. You get this. You get the previous graphic I showed, but just a risk rally. And, of course, yields are continuing to push lower ahead of the Fed conversation. And I guess a step back and really the last page, I'll leave you with this graphic, which really underscores when you look at the VIX futures are actually down still, I believe, well, up ever so slightly in the Asia Pacific, which underscores the calm in these markets amidst and ahead of all possible event risks out there, including the Fed or maybe trade conversations. A lot of the expected vol gauges in the Asia-Pacific have been trending lower and remain below averages, with the exception of Korea, but that, of course, is a market that's done very, very well, so you might get some cheap hedging coming through there. But just to underscore, this Goldilocks scenario, Jomana, that we're in right now across these markets globally.
Yeah. Well, David, to pick up on your analogy, the husband-wife analogy, if I had to pick a side, I'd pick the bond market, because you don't fight the bond market. We all know that.
No.
Thank you so much.
Never. We know that. No.
For the market update. David Inglis in Hong Kong. All right. An emergency summit of Arab and Muslim countries in Doha has declared its solidarity with Qatar and condemned Israel's missile strike on the Qatari capital last week. It coincides with the 5th anniversary of the Abraham Accords, a set of U.S.-brokered agreements that normalize diplomatic relations between Israel and several Arab states. But the Arab world is now faced with a new reality. The war has come to the Gulf, and Israel's attack has further eroded the perception of the U.S. as a reliable security partner. Let's discuss all this with Prem Kumar, partner at DGA-Albright Stonebridge Group and former U.S. National Security Council Senior Director. Good to have you with us. We were just keeping track of the Secretary of State Marco Rubio's movements around the region. He's on his way to Doha now. How would you describe this moment in history in terms of the Gulf Arab states' relationship with the U.S. after the strike that took place on Doha last week?
I think several Arab countries have real questions about the U.S. role in recent events. The first question is, was it really possible for the Israelis not to have it notified the White House in advance of their plans to strike in Doha? Mm-hmm. And second, if they didn't, what does that say about the level of control that the U.S. has or influence over Israel? So both of these factors have come together to lead the Arab states to need much more reassurance from the U.S. As to its relationship with Israel and about the future of the negotiations over the hostages in Gaza in general.
Reports emerged last week suggesting that President Trump was not at all happy with the strike on Doha. And he even said so. He said something to the tune of, "I'm not thrilled with what went down." There was another report that he actually had quite a tense conversation with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu after it happened. But short of verbal altercations, the U.S. has not gone anywhere near as close to some of the Europeans have in terms of applying sanctions or withholding military support. What would be deemed a red line, do you think, in the United States' eyes, for them to start applying more political pressure on Israel?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure that we've really seen indication that the U.S. administration is prepared to apply real pressure on Israel because it's conflicted. It, I think, didn't like the fact that the Israelis struck in Doha, but at the same time, it's made clear that it really doesn't. It holds Hamas responsible for what's gone on in Gaza and believes that more pressure may be needed in order to reach a deal. I think there are still questions about how much Trump knew in advance of the Israeli strike. There is some reporting that the Israelis did notify the U.S. government in some channels before the U.S. military learned about the strikes, and I think that's part of what has concerned the Gulf countries so much.
But it also seems as though Israel's approach to the ceasefire discussions, the negotiations, has also changed. And now, instead of working on the framework of perhaps a phased deal or a phased return of hostages, they're just calling for a complete surrender of Hamas. How likely is it that we actually do see that happening, given how much pressure Hamas are under now also?
Right. I think it's very unlikely that we'll see a complete surrender, capitulation by Hamas. I think it's also clear that increasingly Prime Minister Netanyahu understands that and is willing to prolong the war as long as he can, because that serves his political interests. Unfortunately, I think much of the concern in the U.S. as well as in this region is that right now Israeli policy seems to be driven more by domestic politics than it does by its own national security imperatives when it comes to Gaza, because continuing the war is in the interests of Netanyahu's right-wing coalition partners.
But at the same time, President Trump has said that he would like to see this war wrapped up. I guess the most difficult question here is, what is the end game? What is the off-ramp for the Israeli Prime Minister to stop with the offensives and the ongoing offensives in Gaza City and the various other attacks that are taking place in neighboring countries as well?
Right. I think that Netanyahu has to be able to say that he has defeated Hamas. And clearly the Israelis believe they have to invade Gaza City in order to address remaining pockets of resistance from Hamas. He also needs to be able to secure a release of the hostages. So if some deal can come about where the hostages are released without the Israelis having to accept Hamas's continued presence in Gaza, and they can say that they have so severely degraded Hamas's military capabilities that it's no longer a threat to Israel, then I could see this war coming to an end. But it's hard to imagine those circumstances in the short term.
Okay. Up until, I would say, well, before the war started and it broke out, even up until October 7th, there had been a renewed momentum in the region amongst Gulf Arab states to perhaps even think about normalization. You had the UAE sign on to Abraham Accords exactly 5 years ago. Lots of speculation that maybe Saudi Arabia would be incentivized to do so. Given everything that has happened, not just in the past week, but over the past year, especially the UAE referring to specific red lines now on a potential Israel annexation of West Bank, is it fair to say that normalization has been stopped in its tracks?
I think so. I think the fact that the Emiratis also declared the Israeli strike on Doha to be treacherous was pretty notable. The Saudis, I think, have recognized that without significant progress on Gaza, it's really impossible for them to move forward with normalization. So at this point, I don't think it's a question whether normalization continues, it's whether it potentially recedes.
Do you think Israel wants to normalize with other nations in the region, specifically Saudi Arabia? And the reason I bring this up is because Saudi Arabia have always insisted on there being a viable path towards a two-state solution. But of course, the stance by the Israeli government is that a two-state solution is not something that is acceptable to them.
Right.
So is it possible to even engage in those discussions in the absence of a pathway towards a two-state solution? Does Israel want to achieve this?
I think Israel wants to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. It wants to give as little as it can in exchange for that. And frankly, some of the discussions over the past few years didn't involve Israel giving up very much. It was really, as you said, a pathway towards a Palestinian state, not concrete actions on the ground that would result in a Palestinian state or the establishment of one. And the Saudis were still willing to consider that deal because of everything else they would have gotten from the U.S. Even that sort of deal, I think, is off the table now.
Can I just ask you very quickly, how significant do you think the French-Saudi initiative is to recognize Palestinian statehood at the UN General Assembly?
I think it's really more symbolism over substance, but the fact that 142 out of 164 countries have supported Palestinian statehood says a lot about concern about the Gaza war.
Prem, Kumar, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Prem Kumar, partner at DGA-Albright, Stonebridge Group, and former U.S. National Security Council Senior Director. Thanks. Well, Turkish assets rallied after a court adjourned a case questioning the legitimacy of the main opposition's leadership. The main benchmark stock index jumped after the decision, closing 6% higher yesterday, its biggest daily gain since May 2023. The lira also strengthened against the U.S. dollar. The next hearing into the 2023 Congress of the CHP is now scheduled for October 24, providing short-term relief for both the party and for markets. And coming up, China rules that Nvidia violated anti-monopoly laws with a high-profile 2020 deal. We'll have the latest next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Johannesburg in Dubai. China has ruled that Nvidia violated anti-monopoly laws with a high-profile 2020 deal to acquire Mellanox Technologies. The ruling ratchets up the pressure on Washington during sensitive trade negotiations. For more, let's talk to Bloomberg's Tom McKenzie. Well, Tom, maybe let's just start with this decision out of China yesterday. It goes all the way back to 2020. How likely is it to impact today, 5 years later?
Yeah, Jemana, you're absolutely right. This was a deal that was initially signed off, actually, by Beijing and the Chinese authorities around 4 years ago, a $7 billion deal to take over Mellanox by Nvidia. And at the time when China signed off on this, the rationale was you can do this as long as you don't discriminate against Chinese companies. Now they have found, again, according to their regulators, that Nvidia has violated antitrust laws in China through this deal with this networking business, Mellanox. They have not specified, the Chinese, what will happen as a result of this finding. It's interesting, of course, that it came and the announcement came at a time when both US and Chinese officials, as you say, were meeting in Madrid as part of those broader negotiations. And in fact, the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said it did come up in those talks, and the quote-unquote poor timing of the announcement was something that was discussed between the two sides. The broader picture is that Nvidia has been weaponized by both sides as they try to pursue their aims in the broader set of tensions between these two countries. There was the ban, of course, on the H20 chip into China. Then that was eased. And the Trump administration said you could sell those AI accelerators into the Chinese market if you pay us 15% sales. And then China came along and said, actually, we may not need those, and pressured domestic companies not to buy the H20 on national security concerns. It's a reminder to China saying, if you're going to weaponize Nvidia, we can weaponize it back. Two can play at that game, seems to be the message from China.
Yeah, most definitely. And actually, you know, if we rewind back to the Nvidia earnings, one thing that really stood out to me the last time around is they didn't sell one H20 chip into China in the last quarter. But I guess after yesterday's ruling, it's difficult to see the upside of potential sales in the future because they are still very much caught in the geopolitical crosswinds. Is there a feeling at all that maybe, you know, chips and semiconductors will be included in some of the trade discussions that have been taking place and will continue taking place in the run-up to the new China-US deadline in November?
Yeah, you would have thought it's very likely that chips have to be part of those negotiations, given that both sides have ratcheted up the pressure on the semiconductor industry as part of the broader tensions. We know that President Xi and President Trump will be having a call on Friday. They are trying to lay the groundwork, both sides, for a face-to-face meeting in South Korea at the end of next month. And we know that President Trump has said, look, we have an agreement when it comes to TikTok, at least the framing, the outline of an agreement when it comes to TikTok. But, and I'm paraphrasing, the President Trump has said that it's the big deal with China that he's really looking forward for. He wants, clearly, President Trump wants a grand bargain with China on trade. It's hard to see how that happens without some agreement on what happens to semiconductors and Nvidia.
Yeah. Tom, big questions and obviously very important for Nvidia as well. Tom McKenzie, thank you so much. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following. Elon Musk has responded to his massive pay proposal from Tesla's board by buying about $1 billion in shares, sending the stock into positive territory for the year. He made the purchase through a revocable trust on September 12, signaling confidence in Tesla's future. Musk's $1 trillion compensation plan includes an incentive if the company hits a $400 billion adjusted earnings target by 2035. And Alphabet has joined an elite group of companies valued at more than $3 trillion. The stock's rise is being fueled by a long-awaited antitrust ruling and second quarter earnings showing AI demand lifting sales. The Google parent joins Nvidia, Microsoft, and Apple as the only publicly traded stocks above the $3 trillion level. And coming up, a long-delayed $3 billion project to end a growing water crisis in and around Johannesburg has hit fresh opposition. We'll tell you why next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersetchi in Dubai. Nigeria's annual inflation rate decelerated for the fifth straight month in August. Consumer prices jumped just over 20%, down from almost 22% in July. This opens the door for the central bank to begin trimming record-high borrowing costs next week. Policymakers have kept interest rates at 27.5% for the past 3 meetings, seeking clarity on the direction of inflation. Meanwhile, the Naira has hit a nearly 7-month high. The currency has been boosted by stronger oil export earnings and foreign demand for local debt. This also gives the central bank scope to cut for the first time in 5 years. Now, a long-delayed $3.1 billion project to end a growing water crisis in and around Johannesburg has hit fresh opposition. The project would boost the supply of water from Lesotho to its neighbor, South Africa. Local communities have filed a formal complaint demanding the Lesotho Highlands Water Project be temporarily halted due to the harmful effects they are suffering. For more, let's go to Johannesburg now and speak to Jennifer Zabazaja, Bloomberg's chief Africa correspondent. Jen, talk us through the main concerns around this water project.
Well, Jumana, if we take a look at the formal complaint filed by these people, they list a number of issues, one of them being damage to households. They also say there are broken water pipes. There's also concern around a lack of transparency around specifically the compensation that some of the workers get. They also list a concern about where those displaced by this water project are actually going to be moved to. A number of the other complaints actually dig into social issues like teenage pregnancies that were on the rise, also HIV infections allegedly near the contractors' work camps. But digging into the complaint a little bit more, I was taking a look and just seeing that it wasn't so much opposition to the project itself because, of course, there are concerns around water and the scarcity of water. And so it's seen as a need, this project, but it's more so the environmental and the social effects of it. And so much so that they're actually specifically naming the African Development Bank, which are one of the financiers of this project, as one of the people they believe that should be accountable and at least be a bit more transparent when it comes to this project and others. But it also follows a lot of similar other concerns that we've been seeing across the country with a number of these projects, specifically around water and the issues around water, and just what many people feel is a lack of transparency about what's actually transpiring on the ground.
Yeah, but how much of an impact is this water crisis, the shortage of water, having on the South African economy, Jen?
When we talk to analysts, many people are noting that this is the next issue for the South African government really to address. Of course, we know that power outages and load shedding was something that for a number of years the government was having to work on. Now water has really become front and center. Over the past few days, we actually heard from the president and the African National Congress talking about how they deal with this. So if we just take a look at this Lesotho project, just for example, this was meant to be completed back in 2019. Now it's not set to be completed until 2030. This is affecting Johannesburg here, which is, of course, the commercial capital of South Africa, accounts for 60% of economic output. And many of the concern is around of course, there's the sanitation aspect of this, but then there's also productivity, there's job losses, there's agriculture, tourism, and really how the lack of water or even water that's not necessarily necessarily up to standards could affect the population here. And just more broadly speaking, Jumana, we've heard a number of investments and pledges that have been made into the water sector here. Earlier this year, the president used his State of the Nation address actually to commit some 23 billion rand for a number of projects to address the water crisis. But it's not so much at the federal level that people are concerned. It really boils down to some of the municipalities where people believe that there's been mismanagement and aged and dilapidated infrastructure has not been really dealt with in the right way. So this is going to continue to be an issue for Johannesburg in particular, but the economy more broadly.
Jen, thank you so much for breaking it down for us. Jennifer Zabazaja, Bloomberg's chief Africa correspondent. Thank you so much. Well, we walked in today, some big developments on China-U.S., the talks there, a framework being agreed to on TikTok. President Trump saying that he's looking to have a phone call with President Xi on Friday. So all of that is swirling in the backdrop. But of course, some developments at the Fed as well. Stephen Miran now confirmed. Lisa Cook, an appeals court ruling in her favor. So both of them will be voting members at the big Fed meeting that's set to take place tomorrow. 25 basis point rate cut is what's baked in at this point. But will they sound more dovish about the path ahead? S&P futures yesterday, we saw the S&P close through 6,600 for the first time ever. Today, it is a screen of green as we head into the European Open. That is it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Brisecci in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.